1 Samuel chapter 6 is another really interesting passage of scripture, and the religious historian in me finds it fascinating. I love passages like this that put a stamp on the past. That's because they offer readers today a snapshot of how people thousands of years ago thought about all kinds of things, particularly about religion and culture and faith. At first, I know it seems very remote and in fact even unrelatable. But once you examine the story closer, you begin to see that the Philistines of the past are actually a lot like people of the present. Human nature, after all, hasn't changed that much. In this chapter, I want to highlight two things. First, the belief that the church and state should be intertwined. And second, the judgment against the Levites. So, let's get started. First, I want to unpack the belief that the church and state should be intertwined. In the ancient world, it's a well-known fact that practically all cultures yoke together the church and the state so closely and so tightly that it's impossible to separate them. It doesn't really matter which culture or which people you choose to examine from the past. It could be the Egyptians or the Romans or the Chinese or Native Americans or Congolese or Arabs. Virtually all of them took for granted that religion was as intimately connected to the state or government as sand is to the ocean floor. What's so striking about this is just how different it is from cultures today. Just think, for example, how modern countries respond to pandemics and to wars and to national controversies and other incidents. When all is said and done, religious people aren't really consulted, at least not seriously or enough to actually change the policies of the politicians or of the military. But that is not at all how it worked in the past. Take the chapter at hand. The first thing the Philistines did was to consult their religious leaders. For instance, the passage states, "The Philistines called for their priests and diviners and asked, 'What are we supposed to do with the ark of Yahweh?'" Not surprisingly, the priests and the diviners gave a very religious response. The ark had to be sent back to where it belongs. That's the actual language that's used here in verse 2. And send it back to where it belongs. The idea was simple enough. In the ancient world, the people believed that each region of the world was ruled by a different god or spirit. This belief was widespread, and we see it in multiple passages in the Hebrew Bible. For instance, the book of Micah states, "All the people of the earth, each walk in the name of their gods, but we, Israel, will walk in the name of Yahweh, who is our God." Part of the problem was that the Philistines took possession of a god who was supposed to be ruling over a different part of the world, specifically Israel and not in Philistia. Philistia had its own gods, which we have already seen before. According to their thinking, that is the Philistines, Yahweh was inflicting the Philistines with disease and with plague because Yahweh wanted to be returned to his rightful place of ownership, which of course is Israel. In a similar way, there had to be a guilt offering to the God of the Israelites. This implies right from the start that the problem is caused by the gods. The people were simply the casualties, or the people just watching what was happening. By way of contrast, when countries around the world today sought to understand why a global pandemic was caused, punishment by the gods would not have been an answer that the nations would have collectively found convincing. Next, the guilt offering had to correspond symbolically to something very real. In this case, it was the number of towns and rulers, which were 5 in total, as well as from the actual form of the disaster, tumors and mice. This actually makes a lot of sense. The people, after all, were suffering from tumors as well as an infestation of mice, who were probably the carriers of the plague, just as they were during the Black Death that ravaged Europe in the Middle Ages. In fact, people still use this religious technique today. It's actually very commonly practiced in many parts of the world and among many religions. I first saw this up close when I traveled to Portugal many years ago. I made a stop at the very famous shrine at Fatima, which is one of the most revered pilgrim sites in all of the Roman Catholic faith. It is commonly believed that there, in 1917, the Virgin Mary appeared to 3 children and gave them prophecies and words of comfort. Since then, the children have been canonized by the Roman Catholic Church, and every year, millions of people travel to Fatima from all over the world in order to be healed. One of the common purchases that you can make at the shrine are what are called votive body parts, which are made of wax that are burned as an offering to God. The Portuguese call these promessas de cera, or wax promises. These wax promises are made in the shape of body parts, symbolizing a part of the body that needs divine healing. Pilgrims purchase these wax promises for just a few dollars or euros from a local vendor at the souvenir shop, and then they burn these at the fire pit, which looks like a huge gas grill. The burning of these body parts are offered alongside prayer, and there are countless claims of miracles that have taken place. I provide all this detail not as a way to necessarily endorse this practice, but only as a way to draw a connection between something done as a religious custom centuries ago and something that is still performed today by millions of people. So we don't want to fall trapped to the thinking that the Philistines are a bunch of uneducated yokels. Their religious customs have been used for thousands of years, including today. Next, we hear the religious advice of the priests and diviners as we return to our own story at hand. The leaders counseled that 2 cows who had recently given birth to calves should be hitched to a wagon. Their reasoning was straightforward. If the 2 cows went back toward their calves, which is the natural thing to do, then the whole series of events had been chance. However, if the cows went toward Israel and in the opposite direction of their babies, then the Philistines would know that it was not by chance. Yahweh had engineered it. I now want to briefly discuss one more item, and that is the judgment against the Levites. As we know, the 2 cows carrying the Ark of Yahweh defy nature and habit. Instead of returning to their calves, they walk away from them and they travel to the village of Beth Shemesh, which of course is in Israel. As they do so, it's easy to gloss over one insight that the author makes. The author gives us what seems to be a throwaway comment. In verse 12, he says, the cows were lowing as they went. This means, of course, that the cows were going moo, and we want to know why that is and why the author included it. Well, cows make the sound of moo for a lot of different reasons, but here it's because the mama cows, that is, the heifers, are speaking to their baby calves. It's actually a rather heart-wrenching part of the story where the mama cows tell their baby calves that they love them and they want to return, but they're being overpowered by God. And unfortunately, the fate for both the cows and their calves will be the same: death. When the mama cows arrive in Israel, the first thing the Israelites do is slaughter them on a makeshift altar that's by the village. They turned a giant rock formation into an altar. The people were already outdoors because it was the harvest season of wheat, which means that it was in May or June, a season of life when temperatures are warming and the rain is becoming scarce and the people are celebrating because they will soon get paid. It's a fun time of year. But the celebration is soon turned to mourning. Why is that? Well, it's because Yahweh has killed many of the people in Israel. On this point, though, there is a textual variant. A textual variant is a copying error that occurs from time to time in ancient manuscripts of the Bible. Some texts say one thing and some say another. Depending on your exact translation of verse 19, some will say that Yahweh struck down 70, while others will say Yahweh struck down 50,000. Both numbers are scary and sobering, but the latter is surely the number that is not correct. The number 70 is most likely what is historically accurate. So when you come across this text, if it has 50,000, you can think it's 70, but that's still a lot of people. At any rate, the mood has changed, and we want to know why Yahweh has killed so many of his own people. We might think, after all, that the people in Beth Shemesh did the right thing. For instance, they slaughtered the cows as an offering to Yahweh. They recovered the ark from pagans, and they sought to return the ark to its central location in Israel. All in all, that seems like an excellent turn of events. But there is something bigger going on. We already know that the author pointed out the lowing of the cows, and this is an ominous foreshadowing of this entire passage. The lowing of the cows is telling us that something is not quite right, and that death is coming. Here is what we need to know as background. First, the village of Beth Shemesh was just not a random town. It was what is called a Levitical town. In the history of Israel, various villages were set aside to be Levitical towns. That is, they were places where the Levites, who were the designated priests, were supposed to live. As the book of Joshua states, the Levites, who were descendants of Aaron the priest, were allotted 13 towns from the tribes of Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin. And just a few verses down from that, in verse 16, we're told that Beth Shemesh was one of the Levitical towns that Aaron's descendants were given. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Israelites who took the Ark of Yahweh and ritually sacrificed the cows to Yahweh were legitimate priests. They were the real deal. That is, they were Levitical priests who were in the line of Aaron, who is Israel's first high priest as well as the brother of Moses. In fact, they were what is called Kohathites, who were a specific branch of Levitical priests whose job it was to transport the Ark of Yahweh, meaning that of all of the people in the world, they were the ones and only them who were allowed to transport it. If that is the case, then why did Yahweh kill these priests? After all, weren't they entitled to oversee sacrifices and to touch the Ark of Yahweh? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, yes, they were allowed to make sacrifices to Yahweh. No other tribe members were given the right to do that. However, and this is really important to note, priests were supposed to sacrifice cow bulls, but not cow heifers. That is, the males, but not the females. As the book of Leviticus states, when the offering you make is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. Of all people in the world, the Levitical priests in Beth Shemesh knew all about this law, but they ignored it. Bulls without defect were to be sacrificed, not female cows who had just given birth and who were in no doubt a very weary, exhausted, and feeble condition, and probably had several defects from walking for miles across hills and across mud and across rocks. Next, and this is even more important, the Levitical priests were not allowed by law to peer or to look into the Ark of Yahweh. They were only allowed to carry it with poles, and in fact, they were not allowed to touch it. This is explicitly mentioned many times in the Bible. For instance, the book of Numbers states, "The Levites must not touch the holy things, or they will die." And just for the sake of clarity, this is repeated several verses later. In order to protect the Levites so that they may live and not die when they come near the most holy things, do this. Aaron and his descendants are to go into the sanctuary and assign to each man his work and what he is to carry. However, the Kohathites must not go in to look at the holy things even for a moment, or they will die. Yahweh here has given very specific orders about the ark, and as I mentioned, these orders were repeated many times in the Bible. So, although it's really heartbreaking to hear about the deaths of so many Israelites for looking into the ark, the men killed were priests who knowingly violated the law of God. they were not allowed to touch or to look into the ark. It was prohibited by law, and every priest and layperson knew that. Symbolically, the Ark of Yahweh represented Yahweh himself, and just as no one is allowed to see God, so no one is able to look inside the ark. Most likely, the author tells us this story about the priest being killed because he wants to make the following point. The people of Israel were not following the laws of God, and this is made plain by the fact that not even the priests, that is, the ones who knew better, are any better. Unfortunately, this is not the first story in the Hebrew Bible that judges Levitical priests for their bad behavior. I don't want us to get sidetracked, but if you want to read more, there are two additional interesting yet very gruesome stories about bad Levitical priests, and you can read those in Judges chapter 17, as well as in Joshua chapter 19. In fact, in the book of Samuel, we have already seen God's judgment on Eli's sons, who after all were Levitical priests, just like these men in Beth Shemesh. After all, it was directly due to the bad behavior of the priest Hophni and Phinehas, that is, Eli's sons, that the ark was captured in the first place. This is a constant theme we see. The priests were leading by example, and unfortunately their example was horrendous. Yahweh therefore had to step in and to do something. Despite the bad things going on, the story is not all doom and gloom. At the end of the day, the Israelites have recovered the Ark of Yahweh. And so now we have to ask ourselves, will they learn from their mistakes, or will they continue to stumble? For that, we will have to wait. In the meantime, enjoy your reading of 1 Samuel chapter 6.